My name is Rolf Rosenkranz and I'm the editor of Devex. I'm here at the European Development Days in Brussels, and with me is John Hendra, the Assistant Secretary General of UN Women. John, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Rolf. Great to see you again.
Thank you. And tell me, what is on your agenda now here being in Brussels?
Well, the first thing is really to participate in the European Development Days, especially on a panel in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment in the post-2015 agenda. That's the first item. The second item is really to have discussions with the European Commission, European partners, to see how we can deepen our collaboration and partnership as UN Women and the EC and the Action Service. And then finally is really to be able to do interviews like this in terms of really engage in public advocacy and the importance of any violence against women, but also more broadly in terms of the post-2015 agenda and how really women and girls really have to be at the center of the next development agenda.
And I understand that you're advocating for a standalone goal in that post-2015 global development agenda. Tell me a little bit about it and what sort of blowback are you already perhaps getting? Because this is a controversial idea. Everyone wants their goal to be a standalone, so why gender, and what are you hearing from your partners?
Well, I think we feel very strongly, and I feel very strongly, that we need a standalone goal on gender equality, women's rights, and women's empowerment for three reasons. First, there's a whole set of unfinished business in terms of the current MDGs. Secondly, and also linked to that, is that gender equality there's a lot of substantive evidence that investing in women, in gender equality and women's empowerment, really has a synergistic impact across all goals. Secondly is that I think the current MDG framework did not really get at the root causes of gender inequality. So we need a single goal, a standalone goal, to really focus in terms of addressing directly the sort of structural inequalities, discriminatory attitudes, and the things that really need to be changed, the deep-rooted things need to be changed. And thirdly is we really need a goal as a sort of a focus, a policy focus, policy attention, but also funding. I mean, in terms of DAC figures from 2010 to 2011, in 1 year, the funding for gender equality has gone down 20%. So for those three reasons, we think there should be a standalone goal. We also think it should focus really on three key areas. One, any violence against women and girls. Two, enhancing women's capabilities and access to resources and land, credit, being able to own a bank account, economic empowerment, but also in terms of bodily integrity, sexual reproductive health and rights. And third, really enhancing women's voice in terms of public and private life and also in families and communities. So those are three core things to really address gender inequality, and that's why we think we need a standalone goal. But we also need to make sure across the framework that there are some indicators and targets that will really, very few, but very specific, but that will really change women's lives. So others are advocating a standalone goal, but I strongly believe that this is a different standalone goal. This is critical to achieve not only gender equality, but to achieve successful development.
And can you give us an insight about what type of targets you would choose? Again, nothing is finalized and everyone's still negotiating and thinking about it, but where's your mind at?
I mean, if you just look at the reports on the table, there's a high-level panel report, there's the Global Compact report, there's the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and of course the report of the Secretary General, A Life of Dignity for All. I'll just use one quick example. The Global Compact report has all of those have a standalone goal. The Global Compact has a standalone goal on gender equality and women's empowerment. They have 4 indicators and 4 targets, two of which, one is to recognize and enforce the gender wage gap, which is about, it was significant, it's 10 to 30%, but about 23% globally is the average. And then secondly, to ensure that women's leadership is at least 40% in public and private sector. So that's the Global Compact. These are, 500 very progressive companies, but that's coming from those companies. So I think that shows how important it is and how much sort of energy there is around a standalone goal. But if we implemented just those 2 targets, it would be really transformational for women. So we believe there should be a number of targets like those, but also including in terms of violence, in terms of access to resources, in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights.
And you mentioned that funding for gender-related issues has gone down significantly over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Do you think that will ever go up? And I suppose you're talking about traditional donors. You mentioned the private sector.
Yeah.
Are we getting to a point where we have to accept this new normal, that the traditional governmental donors are funding this less, and that we just have to go with the private sector?
I think we can't accept. I mean, gender equality and addressing women's issues and women's rights has been chronically underfunded for many years. But I just think that 1 year figure I gave you is really illustrative of how seriously the issue is. But again, investing, there's so much evidence in terms of women's economic empowerment, women's political participation, how important it is to have women making decisions. Businesses that have women on their boards and in management, of the Fortune 500 companies that have the largest proportion of women in terms of management, their profits are 34% more than those who have the least. So there's so much evidence out there. I think it's all about effectiveness. It's all about effective development. It's all about empowerment of women and helping women achieve their economic, social, and political rights. So I think we actually can't afford not to increase investment, and I think there's a lot of evidence as well in terms of how cost-effective investment that is. But to do that, to turn it around, we need to have much greater understanding of the importance of gender equality, how important it is to address it. But really, that's why we need this kind of focus. That's a policy focus, but also a focus to turn around funding. Of course, the private sector is also funding much more in terms of initiatives. There's again, with the Global Compact report, you see a sea change in terms of attitudes about business. So this is, as the Secretary General said at the General Assembly in September, the 21st century should be the century for women. So it's about time that we catch up with that statement and really invest much more in gender equality and women's empowerment.
How do you think that will play out in the aid industry? How will you operationalize this, or how should other donors operationalize it? And what does that mean for the implementing organizations, the consulting firms, the NGOs that are doing this kind of work? How do they need to restructure as a response?
I think an important part of the whole post-2015 discussion is accountability. So what kind of accountability framework, and how do we make sure that governments, that private sector, that partners are actually walking the talk, not just in a rhetorical way, but are really putting their money where their mouth is. So we need to really much better track it. So we need to be able, from the individual development project level, program level, really look at gender markers, so we're able to really able to track how much money actually goes towards addressing women's needs and gender equality. We need to look at different gender scorecards, like the EC has globally. How are our projects and programs doing in terms of the targets that they set? As agents and agencies and partners, setting at least voluntary targets in terms of how to move towards much greater levels of women in decision making. Also in terms of looking at much more gender impact assessment. So I think there's a lot of concrete tools and measurements. But the old adage is you become what you measure. So I think we need to be much more serious as a development community about measuring how much we are actually, if we believe what I've tried to argue, if we believe that investment in women and investment in gender equality is a really smart investment in terms of development and the realization of women's rights, then we need to be able to track that. So there's a lot of instruments to use, but we need to accelerate them, and then we need to make sure those results are being discussed much more broadly in terms of boards of agencies, more publicly, and in terms of really are we accelerating change fast enough?
Would you advocate for mainstreaming gender issues in a way whereby donors in every project that they would fund, they have a component explicitly that they request from their partners?
Yeah.
That addresses gender.
I think it's really important to mainstream gender, and that we're always asking the question to ensure that whatever intervention we're doing is gender responsive, and is really looking at trying to address which is still significant levels of inequality and gender inequality. So we need to ask those questions and ensure in mainstreaming, but we can't mainstream into invisibility. So that's why, and more broadly, as was set out in Beijing, was we need a two-track approach. We need to directly address and have interventions to address gender inequality. But then the second track was we need to make sure that it is properly mainstreamed, properly addressed across the framework. But we need to be, when we're doing the mainstreaming, we need to really be clear that we're really looking at how these interventions, all interventions, are really impacting on women.
Now, you and women, if we step back for a second, is a project in itself that is very young.
That's true.
Still, and it's still evolving. You don't have much money,
especially
especially not a lot of money for technical assistance. So there's only a limited amount of influence, some might argue, that you can have on this industry. What would you say are your successes so far, and what have been the biggest challenges or perhaps even failures?
Well, the good news is, since I spoke to you a year ago at the European Development Days, is that we've actually had quite an uptick, particularly in contributions to our core resources. So I think we're turning the corner, and I think the narrative should no longer be simply about UN Women does not have enough resources. Our ambition is not large in terms of resources, but we do need more than what we have. However, our role really is a policy normative role to help set normative standards. And a big success was this past March, the Commission on the Status of Women, that we had agreed conclusions, an agreed framework on any violence against women, which brought a higher level of normative standards for all countries to implement. But really our role is also very much on advocacy, and being able to also make sure that at the highest level and more at the strategic level, that gender equality really, and women's rights and women's empowerment is really addressed. So I think another success is still to be determined, but I think we've been very proactive on the post 2015 agenda, and very proactive in terms of why we think it needs to be rights-based and why we need to really focus on gender equality and women's empowerment. And thirdly is we're starting to see a number of real, very good concrete results at the country level and the regional level, because ultimately that will really help and will really validate whether we're doing a good job. If our partners in civil society and governments in, say, Pakistan, where we helped to double the number of women that registered for the election six weeks ago, or in terms of Brazil, we have a very innovative phone app in terms of trying to make Rio more safe for women. We're sort of safe-scaping Rio in terms of ensuring that the violence against women and girls goes down. A number of very concrete examples. So I think those three areas where we're having successes. Challenges are still remains the resources, but again, I think there's so much that we can be doing and are doing in terms of public advocacy, in terms of normative, bringing the normative framework up in terms of women's rights and women's empowerment, but also in terms of making sure that the UN as a whole lifts its game, is as coordinated as possible on gender equality and women's empowerment. And there we're seeing much more kind of engagement by UN country teams, much more focus in UN peace missions on gender equality and the situation of women. And maybe finally is this big discussion about any violence against women and girls. It's on newspapers every day, from Mumbai to Maryville. But in a way, I think what is really important is that, you know, not only through UN Women, but through many people have really stimulated this discussion. I think once you really start to discuss seriously the real issues, then it opens up the sort of, not Pandora's box, but it opens up, you know, an opportunity to really discuss what's wrong and what can be done. And there I think we are starting to move towards a tipping point where people are really, really focused on how do we really start to move forward concretely in that area. So I think those are some of the successes and challenges, but I think that I look forward to hopefully seeing you here next year, and I could say that we have even more resources, but even more positive results for women and girls.
Yeah, and I look forward to talking with you then. Maybe if I could ask you finally, in a year from now, or let's say in the next year, what are 3 things that you would love to get, would love to have, that could make your work so much easier? You know, 3 things that UN Women needs right now that would increase its impact.
I think the first thing I would focus on is that we had this big success with governments and partners at the CSW on the agreement on any violence against women. But not as much attention was given to an agreement by the UN Statistical Commission on 9 indicators for every country in the world to track violence against women. I would love to see in the next year that these indicators really get aggressively rolled out to every country in the world, so that on November 25th, every parliament around the world can stand up and look at where they were last year and where they are this year in terms of the incidence of violence against women and girls. So that would be one. A second thing would really be able to see on the post-2015 agenda that beyond the focus on gender equality and women's empowerment, that it really becomes a transformational agenda, that it really looks at issues of inequality It's a universal agenda, because gender inequality is a universal challenge. So I would very much love to see in a year's time that the ambition, the high level ambition we have so far, is maintained as we go through the intergovernmental process, and particularly this agenda will address some of the issues, the most critical issues that frankly people around the world are clamoring for. And finally, I think it would be to really see much greater improvement in women's economic empowerment and political empowerment. The World Economic Forum publishes a gender gap report every year, and now they have a 96% the gap has been closed in terms of health, 93% in education. But in terms of economic equality, it's 61%. In terms of political participation, political equality, 21%. At that level, it'll take 2065 to the year 2065 in terms of really ensuring equality. And then Ban Ki-moon's 21st century for women is almost over. So I would love to see those two indicators, economic equality, political participation, and political equality, at least in the next year, if not the next few years, have quite a significant change. But to do that, we need to really address these underlying constraints, structural factors that really hold women back. And so I think that would be the third thing would be great to see.